So I'm Joe, I work at Brasenose College, Oxford, and then who else?
Hi everyone, I'm Catharine, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Schools Liaison Officer at St Catherine's College in Cambridge, Catz for short.
Hi, I'm a first year physical natural sciences student at Cambridge, and my name is Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm a second year medic at Brasenose College, Oxford.
Marvellous. So, Kathryn, do you want to go to the first slide? Thank you. All right, so I just want to kind of set the scene and then Kathryn will take over in a second. We've got a few plans for this session. We're going to go through a few slides and kind of introduce the topics to you. Then we're going to do a couple of exercises, one of which will involve you actually writing some stuff down or typing some stuff down. So see if you can get like a notepad or like a computer ready to type some stuff for later. And then we're also going to have a look at a real personal statement example and kind of break it down and look at it and critique it really. So those are the plans. And then at the end, we'll probably have a Q&A. So in the Q&A box, you can write whatever questions you have for us. We might well wait till the end until we answer them verbally, but then again, we might just type some answers when we can. So look out for answers that are typed. In the Q&A box, you can upvote any questions that you also would have asked, and you can ask them anonymously as well. So feel free to do that, but it might be at the end. Probably not asking Chloe and Stephanie to cut and paste their actual personal statements into the Q&A box, because the whole idea of a personal statement is that it has to be personal, it has to be yours. However, I will be asking Chloe and Stephanie to talk all about the stuff that they put in their personal statement, so they will be spilling the beans later on. So I'm just going to kick off with this first slide. The thing with your personal statement is it's subject specific. So it has to be about the subjects or subject that you want to apply for at university. And it's got to be academic. We want it to be a scholarly piece of information. We want to know what the tutors are looking for are your suitability and enthusiasm for the subject, for your subject. So you always have to think that's what they're thinking about when they're reading your personal statement. So it isn't like a kind of popularity contest. It's more, would you flourish on the course or the courses that you're applying for? So always keep that in mind. If you think about it, it's the one bit of the application process that you've got complete control over. Everything else is like an interaction between the universities or out of your control. But the personal statement is where you're in control and you're in the driving seat, which is a really great thing to remember. It's a kind of empowering document, really. It's actually quite short. It ends up being like a page of typed up writing, 4,000 characters. So it isn't a particularly long document. So you do have to be quite concise. And actually, I thought I'd just ask Chloe and Stephanie, maybe starting with Chloe. Did you find that you had to edit your stuff down to be within the character limit, or was it about trying to work it up so it was near the character limit?
Yeah, I think the first one. So I started before I even started writing. I sort of mind mapped everything that I could talk about, and then sort of prioritized that, and then focused on trying to make it flow like a story. So instead of being like, I read this book and then I went to this lecture and then I did this and this, it was more like I read this book which made me interested in dementia. So then I went to a lecture about dementia and so on. So it reads as a story of how my interest in the subject developed rather than just stating facts.
Great, we're keen on stories. Stephanie, what would you say about that?
I would say I had a sort of similar experience. I guess like at the start when I wasn't really sure how to write it and I was pretty much just listing things, it was a struggle for me to reach the word count. But then when I tried to change how I was writing about it and made it like a story as Chloe did, it was more me having to cut it down. But yeah, it was more me having to cut it down.
Yeah, brilliant. And that's it's a good sign really that you've got lots to say, but you want to pick the most important things. But anyway, more about that later. I think it's got to be personal in bold. So when you think about your statement, it's got to be your work, and so you've got to make sense of the stuff that you're reading and the stuff that you like yourself, and try and find your own interpretations and ideas. But again, more about that later. And just so you know, it does go to all of your university choices. So you've got to try and make sure that if you're applying for a variety of different courses, that it's kind of relevant in a way to all of them. But tutors are very liberal and they like reading personal statements, even if, you know, there's bits that aren't exactly relevant to their course. So nothing to worry about too much. The last thing I wanted to say before Kathryn gets a go is, so you think about personal statements as really important because the tutors, it's the first thing that they look at really when you apply. It's their it's your chance to introduce yourself to them. But you might also occasionally read stuff about some university tutors not caring about personal statements and not wanting to read them or something. I think that's largely untrue. I think tutors do read them, but it is true that they're not always the be all and end all. They're not always the one thing that they look at. They might also look at interviews or aptitude tests and other things. So that is true. It's not always the one thing, you know, the most important thing. But you've got to still write a brilliant one, right? Because you don't know exactly how the tutor's going to take it. But the other thing that's perhaps a bit underrated, is that the personal statement is something for you as well. So it gets your thoughts in order and gets you enthusiastic and excited about your subject and helps you understand how to convey that. So it's a really great way of just starting your application on the front foot and giving yourself like a head start to begin with. So I think you can think about your personal statement, not just for the tutors, but for your own kind of personal academic development, really. Okay, over to Kathryn.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so I'm going to move on to talking about what universities are actually looking for in the personal statement. So you know the purpose and you know that you have to write one, but this is kind of laying out what universities actually want. And you'll see all sorts of different stuff on the internet and people will have different opinions. And some people worry that Oxford and Cambridge are looking for completely different things to the universities and that you've got to do something completely different for us. And that's not the case. We're looking for the same things as other universities, as other selective universities. So we're looking for an explanation of why you've chosen the course. You know, we want to know why you want to do it. We're looking for you to demonstrate your enthusiasm and your commitment to your chosen course. So I'll go into more detail in a bit about how you can actually demonstrate that. We want to see if you've got any particular areas of interest in your subject. So like Joe said, personal statement is personal. This will be completely different for everyone. There might be a whole bunch of people applying for medicine, but there can be such a range of things within medicine that might actually interest someone about that course. And when tutors are looking at personal statements, they want to see what is it that's really inspired you to do the subject and what is it that you love. They want to see descriptions of what you've done to learn and prepare. So that includes talking about what you gain from doing super-curricular or extracurricular activities. So all the ways that you've been able to engage with your learning at school and then in particular outside of school. Some of you will already be familiar with these terms, super-curricular and extracurricular. For those of you who weren't able to attend our session on super-curriculars, our subject exploration session that we did last month, the link is now up on YouTube. I think Joe can probably pop it in the chat for you for anyone who couldn't come along. But just to quickly summarise that you know what we're talking about when we continue with this presentation today, we're talking about relevant subject-related activities that you've done on your own outside of your school syllabus. And this can be all sorts of things. This can be free Future Learn courses. It can be doing maths problems that you found online. It can be watching TED Talks related to your subject. It can be watching documentaries. It can be just doing some extra science outside of school, watching YouTube videos that explain about different concepts that you've touched on at school, but you want to look at in more depth. We also chatted about in our subject exploration webinar the importance of keeping a record of everything that you're doing super-curricular wise. And it might be that you haven't done any yet, and that's absolutely fine. Don't panic. You've got plenty of time. And some of these things, it might be things that you're already doing. You might already be part of a club, or you might already read like a magazine to do with your subject that's not, you know, part of your schoolwork. There might already be things that you're doing that are super-curricular activities, and they're absolutely valid. And as you go along, it's really important to critically engage with the activities that you're doing, because the point isn't just to list them in a personal statement, it's to actually talk about them, talk about what you gain from them. And as I think Chloe was mentioning before, yeah, not just listing them, but showing how they connect to one another, and so drawing those connections between different topics. And then speaking of extracurricular activities, this is something different. So extracurricular activities is what we're calling things usually like sport or music, unless you're applying for music, of course. It might be things like being on the student committee at school. If they're not directly related to your course, to the subject and academic content, then this is what we would call an extracurricular activity. And Oxford and Cambridge don't take these into account. So you might have seen a few articles a few months back about our heads of admissions basically saying we don't take these into account. It's not going to make or break your application whether or not you were captain of a school football team or not. However, it doesn't mean that you should stop doing any extracurricular activities. I'm sure you're doing because you also find them fun, so continue doing them. And B, some universities are interested in hearing about them. However, if you are going to include them in a personal statement, then as I put here, you've got to demonstrate that you've got transferable skills relevant to the degree that you're applying for, and only let these be a very small portion of the personal statement. And as we've mentioned earlier with super-curricular activities, don't just list them. So don't just say, I play football. That's not going to show anything about you as a person. You can say, you know, I play football and that's built up my team management skills, etc., and kind of work it into why you're a great candidate for this course that you've applied for. And just at the end here, we've put a note, keep your personal statement at least 80% academic and course-related content. And I've got here a good template for using. You don't have to use this as a template, but this is quite a handy template for a personal statement. If you're not quite sure of the format and you're not quite sure how much content should be academic related or extracurricular and how much time to spend on opening and closing paragraphs, you'll see here that the main body that we want to see is all to do with your subject, why you want to study it, and what you've learned from the super-curricular exploration that you've done of your subject. I'm going to go through some top tips, and I'd also really like to hear from our student helpers if they agree with any of these or they found any of these useful, or that they might have found them useful but weren't told about them at the time by teachers or whoever. A lot of people often come to Oxford or Cambridge and they haven't actually heard these things before, so they perhaps didn't write the strongest personal statement in the world, but they still got in. So we really would ask you not to spend loads of time agonizing over like the perfect opening sentence or the perfect closing statement. Just get into your content as soon as you can. Get into chatting about why you want to do the course, why you want to do it specifically. And don't worry about being flashy and having to do something really snazzy in your personal statement. I think this is a myth that a lot of people have for Oxbridge in particular, but we don't need you to do anything flashy. Depth is often better than breadth, so you don't need to include absolutely everything you've ever done that you think could be relevant, or you don't need to include all your A-levels, your APQ, if you've done any work experience. You don't have to cram absolutely everything in there. As Joe said, it's actually not that long a document at the end of the day, and if you picked a few solid examples that you want to talk about, you won't have room to put everything in. And this links into the next point that we said, discuss, don't just list. So really don't just, think I've got to get everything in, so I'm just going to list it all so that everything's in there, because that's not going to tell an admissions tutor as much as you think it's going to tell them. They really want to know what you've got out of these activities that you've been doing and what interests you about the course. Similarly, we ask you to show, so don't just tell. So if you're saying you're passionate about the subject, if you're saying you've got an interest in something, then actually demonstrate that to us with examples and with evidence, not by just telling us. It sounds quite obvious, but make sure you're writing in clear, understandable English. Check your spelling, check your grammar, and get someone else to have a little look over it if you can. It might be that you've thought about a sentence so much in your head that it stopped sounding like a proper sentence to anyone else, and someone else can have a read and say, that doesn't really make sense, it doesn't read how you think it does. So that's really worth doing as well. As I said before, making sure all info is supported by evidence, but also making sure it's relevant and relevant to the course that you're applying for. And I've also put at the bottom here to check out Ucas Guidance. Ucas is a fab website. If you haven't discovered it yet, it's what you use to apply to universities through, and they've got a really concise guide for personal statements, and you don't need any other source to apply to Oxford or Cambridge. You can use the Ucas Guidance. It's absolutely fab. I'm going to pick on Stephanie and Chloe, what were your experiences of writing the personal statement? And do you have any tips that you would add to these, or anything that you would expand on within this?
Yeah, so my experience writing my personal statement. So I'd say that I started quite late in the process, and I had a lot of drafts. But one thing that I always sort of say is, don't focus on the number of drafts you have. Don't feel like there's a certain formula to write in the correct personal statement. Like, everyone has their different ways of doing it. And yeah, I think one piece of advice that really helped me was, if someone that's not studying my subject, for example, because I study natural sciences, if someone that's studying humanities were to read my personal statement and understand it, then it's not detailed enough and it's not specific enough, because it should be something that, it doesn't have to use big words or complex things or talk about really complex ideas in detail, but it should show enough that it should show enough to show that you've done wider reading and that you've explored it in a bit more depth than someone who just studied it at GCSE.
Yeah, so extra things is definitely important, and linking them in, like we've said, but you don't have to do like the biggest thing ever. Especially with medicine, people will get a bit over the top or get really worried that you have to do something special. It's not about what you do, it's about how you reflect on it. So even if you just manage to get like 2 days work experience in a care home, which is what I did, that's just as impressive as someone who's gotten a week with a top surgeon in London or whatever. It doesn't matter, because what matters is what you're getting from it and how you reflect on that in a personal statement. And that's what the tutor's bothered about. They don't care if you've seen someone really cool. They just want to know what you're getting out of it.
Thanks so much, Chloe. I think that's actually helped to answer a whole bunch of questions that we've got in the Q&A box, of people saying, do I have to have taken part in an essay competition? Do I have to have work experience for this or that subject? Do I have to take part in an Olympiad? Do I have to, have done some groundbreaking research into my subject? No. Hopefully, if you check out the link that Joe's put in there for our subject exploration session, you'll see that it can be things like reading magazines, listening to free podcasts, watching YouTube recordings of like explanations, watching free online lectures. You don't have to have gone anywhere. You don't have to have spent any money. You don't have to have all these amazing resources in order to still be able to carry out great super-curricular activities. So if you're worried about what you can do for your subject, please do take a look on that recording, because we've got so many links in the YouTube description as well for places where you can find sources. I'm now going to move on to talking about what not to do with the personal statement, and a lot of pitfalls that some students and often teachers, parents and guardians as well might fall into. So these are things that you've really got to avoid when you're writing your personal statement. Unless you're only applying to one university, then don't name any specific universities in your statement. Some people think that if they're applying to Oxford or Cambridge, they have to mention us, name drop us, so that we know that they want to come to us. You absolutely do not. We know that some people will apply to 4 or 5 universities, so you don't need to put any names in there. The only real reason you might have for sometimes mentioning the name of the university is if, say, you've gone to a taster lecture that a university's ran, or you found an online resource or something like that, and then you can say that you have, but don't feel like you have to mention any of the unis that you're applying to. Avoid repeating yourself and waffling, because you've got such a condensed amount of space and that you really don't want to just be saying the same thing over and over again. You want every sentence and every paragraph to be bringing new information to the admissions tutor. In a similar way, don't define the subject. Some people feel the need to be like, what is philosophy? And then go into a whole thing about it. And you don't have to waste time doing that. Just go into your love for the subject. You don't need to make this sound like an essay where you've got kind of whole long introductory quote or anything like that. On that note, try and avoid jokes and quotes. Again, this is your chance to sell yourself to admissions tutors. Quotes are just going to take up space. They're someone else's words. You really don't need them. It falls into the next category as well of a cliche. A lot of people do use quotes because they think it's going to help them to stand out. You don't have to. Just use your own words, because they're much more valuable than somebody else's. Try and avoid starting every sentence with I. It often ends up becoming a bit of a list. Try and avoid, like we said with the waffling, try and avoid unnecessary language, and you don't have to think that everything has to sound fancy and be longer words or anything like that. You want to get as much as you can into the characters that you've got. And this last one is really important not to lie. As Joe mentioned, at Oxford and Cambridge, often your personal statement will be asked about an interview. It's going to be really obvious if you've said something incorrect on there. Don't over-exaggerate. Again, it will become clear if you said that you're a huge fan of a certain author and you've actually never read any of their books or something like that. And also don't copy from others. The personal statement is personal to you, and also Ucas does check for plagiarism. So please just make sure it's a unique piece of work to you and that you haven't copied from anybody else. I'm going to hand over to Joe now, who's going to take you through a bit more of something a bit more practical to what we've just been doing. So if you have got a notes app on your phone, or you've got a pen and paper nearby, or you've got a computer and you can open Microsoft Word or something like that, then we'd really ask you to do that, because this next part of the session will involve you writing a bit of stuff down.
Right, yeah, so we're going to do this kind of exercise. The first one is quite easy, so it's a bit of a warm-up really, but we're going to give you like 2 minutes to do it once I've explained it. We'd like you to think about what you've encountered already. What have you read? What lecture might have you watched online? What podcasts might you listen to? What blog do you read? Anything that's inspired you intellectually, something to do with your university subject of choice. I'd like you to just write a couple down. So I'm not talking about embellishing on it. I'm not talking about writing big paragraphs about it yet. I just want you to write down a couple of ideas, just topics that you've encountered. Might be in your own time, or it might be something that you're inspired by from your A-levels, because I'm sure your teachers are always inspiring you. So just spend a minute or two doing that. Write some ideas down. Then after 2 minutes, we're going to get you to write in the chat box any of the things that you've written down, just like one-line things, because it'd just be really interesting to see what kind of things that you have come up with. And then I'll get Chloe and Stephanie as well to give us, very short ideas about the little topics that they looked into, a couple of which I've already mentioned. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I'm going to time it. I'm going to turn my camera off so you don't have somebody staring at you. And then if type whatever, if you finish, just start typing in the chat box, just so it's separate from the Q&A maybe, what kind of things that you've put. It's just interesting to see. We're not making any notes. Okay, see you in 2 minutes. All right, I think that was 2 minutes, maybe. So obviously I've got the chat open, and I hope everyone else has too, because it's just seeing this amazing torrent of interesting stuff that's coming through. It's just going too fast for me to read out, but you can all look at it. And isn't it brilliant? It's amazing, all the things that you find interesting. And that isn't like that much of a theme, actually. It's just loads of other stuff. Don't be worrying though if you're like, I haven't got anything yet, because you will. You just need to spend a bit of time over the summer or something thinking of things, and you'll be just like everyone else with typing loads of stuff in. Okay, so if you haven't typed anything in yet, please do. But in the meantime, starting with Stephanie, what were your kind of topics? So don't embellish, because I'm going to get you to do that later. Just tell us what your topics were.
My main topic was actually, I've got my personal statement up, but my main topic was just about human interactions with technology and how physics can sort of help with that.
Amazing, thanks. And what about you, Chloe?
So I talked about GP documentaries, just normal ones that you see on TV, nothing special. Mini medical school at Newcastle University, and then just interesting cases from my own work experience or from talking to other doctors or whatever.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's great. I'm gonna the chat I'm gonna save for posterity, I think, because it's just a brilliant set of ideas. Good. So if you do next slide, please, says Christopher Whitty. Thank you. Next up, I want you to do something a bit harder. I want you to pick one of those examples, whichever one you want. Now, you might pick the one that's like your favorite, or you might be tough on yourself and pick the one that you weren't sure about, but you put in anyway, and try and begin to work it up into a paragraph. Now, this isn't something I want you to type into the chat because it'd just be too long. But what I want you to do is right now, we're going to give you 5 minutes, start thinking about how you could bring up, how you could build up that tiny example that you've typed in to something a bit more meaningful and a bit more profound. Okay, so think about, why do you find that example interesting? Why do you find that topic interesting or intriguing? It might even be frustrating. Something that you got an emotion about, it might not be an overly positive emotion. You might be frustrated because the answers aren't there, or the methodology of the thing you're reading was rubbish, or something like that. So it might not necessarily all be positive things. And just try and build it up. Try and think of more, go into more depth about what your personal reflections are, and think what you would say in a kind of longer conversation about it. So try and build that up. You can also think about how your topic fits into the wider landscape. So if you're interested in the human heart, how has that helped your overall understanding of the human body or something? Or if you're interested in a particular bit of astrophysics, how has that helped us understand the universe? So it's a kind of "this has taught me" kind of sentence. So you do that, or you can think about, you can think about how that topic leads on to something else. So what has that triggered in your brain? What else might you want to find out? So you're interested in the heart, and the next thing for you to find out is how it relates to the lungs or something like that. So try and just build up in your brain. It might be like a kind of spider diagram or what mind map that Chloe mentioned earlier. It might be just a list. It might be like you actually start writing sentences. But we want you to do that. We want you to start, and I just want you to feel empowered that you can do this, that you can start building up these narratives. Okay, so we're going to give you 5 minutes. I'm going to go away, put the kettle on. I'm going to come back and see what you think. But then we won't get you to type it. We'll just get Stephanie and Chloe maybe to say a bit more about their examples that they gave. Okay, so your 5-minute clock starts now. Okay, so I've given you a generous 7.5 minutes. So hopefully you're just maybe finishing off some ideas. But of course, you don't need to finish it for this. You can just pick it up afterwards if you want to. You might be able to do what you've just been doing on a couple of other of your examples, and just see how they work. Like, do you feel there's more to say? Do you feel you can have ideas and interpretations about those examples? So hopefully this has been something that's useful and has taught you that you've got stuff to say and you've got interesting stories to tell. But anyway, let's see what Chloe and Stephanie would say. So maybe start with Chloe. So you mentioned a couple of examples earlier. I wrote them down. You've got GP kind of placement examples and cases and stuff that you found.
Yeah, so I started off with GP documentaries. That's genuinely what got me interested in medicine. And I just sort of said why that was interesting to me. So I said that because medicine was science with people, because I didn't want to do just purely science, but then I still wanted some science. So that's what I said. And then I sort of linked that into my other reading. So a lot of people in the chat have put in some really interesting own interests, which is great. My interest in A-levels was HIV and viruses, so I talked about that a little bit, but it's nice to see that people are finding their own thing and not just all doing the same thing, because I think that's more important, and that shows, especially in the interview when you're talking about it. So yeah.
Brilliant. That sounds really interesting. And Stephanie, what would you say along similar lines?
I would say, so for my personal statement, as I said, it was all about like using physics to enhance people's interactions with technology. And what helped me start that off was a TED talk that I watched. And I just sort of spoke about how that, like, I just sort of spoke about that TED talk a bit. And I thought about ideas, because it was about a smart device. And I just thought about my own ideas around that smart device and how I sort of went into it and I researched it just a bit more. And I found out the physics behind it and how much that interested me. And then I spoke about a residential that I did, a STEM residential that I did at Cambridge, and how I built on that and how I read some books about it. I read a book about quantum gravity, and I just spoke about how I'm interested in quantum physics, things like that. So yeah, that was how I did it.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I just think you just need to expose yourself to interesting ideas, however way you like. We don't really mind, particularly if it's like work experience, if it's reading, if it's podcasts, if it's like something else, and just let it soak in, and ideas will come, and you'll start to get your own interpretations and your own little nuances, your own kind of ideas about it. Yeah. So just kind of you just got to let that happen. See if you can see links between the different things that you're reading or interested in. So it's time for a more concrete example. We're going to look at a personal statement that a first year at my college kindly lent us. So do you want to put the next slide on? Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is this. We are going to read out the personal statement. We're going to look at it together. I'm going to get Stephanie, Catherine and Chloe to help me read the paragraphs. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and be critical. Critical doesn't mean negative. It means we're going to try and critically appraise the personal statement. And really what we're doing is we're kind of pretending we're the admissions tutors, and thinking about the personal statement as whether it tells us that this person would enjoy studying. It's a physics personal statement, so we're figuring out if this person would enjoy studying physics at university. So more specifically, we're going to think about motivation and enthusiasm for the subject, and that's the most important. That's the headline, really. Does this person seem sufficiently excited, interested, intrigued, and passionate about physics that they would be interesting to teach and they would flourish on the course? So that motivation and enthusiasm, that always has to be in your brain when you're writing your personal statements, but also for this little exercise when we're thinking about kind of appraising this personal statement that we're about to see. I think we'd want to see specific areas of interest. We want to see that depth that we spoke about earlier. So we're looking not for loads of generalizations. We're looking for like specific little dipping in to 2 or 3 ideas typically. So we'll look for that. So we're looking for that kind of depth. I guess we're also looking for what they've learned and maybe how they've prepared for the course. But I think learned is probably the thing that we can keep in our brains, like what have they said about how they've moved on, like how their academic journey has gone, where they've sailed to, kind of thing. So we're looking for that. And we're also thinking about like what they've gained, which is very similar, isn't it? But, from their supercurricular work, so stuff that they've done outside of the classroom, how have they grown from it? And they might also, we'll look at the extracurricular activities as well, just for fun, and see what we think of those. I guess the final point is clear communication. Even for science personal statements, we want you to try to be clear about what you're saying and use kind of plain English, basically. So let's see if we feel that this personal statement is just using too many long words and it's all muddled and we don't understand it, or is it clear? Is it clearly signposted and nicely structured, and is the language clear? So those are the things we're going to be looking at. I've got a slide later on which puts these words back in, so you don't need to worry about copying them down. But now we're going to read it out. So here we go. Next slide, please. Right, I'm going to do the first paragraph, and then we'll go for Chloe for the next paragraph, if that's all right. Just got to move myself slightly. When I ask questions in maths, I usually get told I will find out next year or at university. However, in physics, often there is no answer. This seems much more interesting. It feels like there is a vast expanse and everything we know is just a tiny dot. I want to make that dot a bit bigger.
One of my favourite parts of the A-level course was creating a presentation on quantum entanglement. It provided the opportunity to learn and to tell others about something new and inexplicable. I used a simple model of the concept to make it understandable. The idea that particles have a spin, and changing the spin of a particle in an entangled pair would cause the other would change the other instantaneously. I also talked about the chat's in the way. I also talked about the recent research studying quasars to find evidence for the theory. However, I could not fill in the how does it work section I'd created for the presentation. Everywhere I tried to research it, I found that most people disagreed about the concept itself, never mind its explanation. It felt far more satisfying than finding an absolute answer.
Marvellous. I'm going to go for Kathryn for the next paragraph.
Astrophysics for me is the part of physics I feel most pulled towards. The reason why it is so incredible is that astrophysics combines almost all the disciplines of physics into many different applications. It allows the researcher to use almost every part of the subject. For someone who loves the pure areas of maths, it paves the way for using even the most theoretical ideas to a practical end. When I read Calculating the Cosmos by Ian Stewart, I was fascinated by the 3 or 2.5 body problem. I followed a method for finding the first Lagrange, I don't know if that's French, point, and then used it on my own to find the second one.
Stephanie, next paragraph.
The Planets by Professor Brian Cox and Andrew Cohen taught me about the greatest explorations of space, such as the Cassini mission, which revolutionized the way we think about Saturn and its rings. While reading the book, I wrote down a list of questions that came to my head. For example, do satellites have to take into account the magnetic field of the planet they orbit? When looking for the answers, I found more questions.
One thing I found fascinating was seeing how ancient scholars can find out so much information using the limited technology available to them. For example, Eratosthenes figured out that the circumference of the Earth was by measuring shadows. This offers an interesting contrast to areas such as the CERN project, showing that physics is accessible to almost anyone. When visiting CERN in Geneva, it showed me how much funding and how many opportunities there are in physics. I found using the cloud chamber especially intriguing. It took particle physics from something mysterious taught in a classroom to something I could physically see in front of me. During school, I've completed several of the UK MT maths papers. I enjoyed them because they are almost pure logic, and the questions are different to regular exam questions. They also allowed me to spend a week at an Oxford summer school where I solved problems as a group and saw more complex questions. I enjoyed the more independent learning style, similar to university. It also helped me realise how I preferred physics to maths because I learned more about the applications. Go on, Chloe.
Beyond physics, I have a strong interest in art, creating intricate pictures often inspired by the celestial. I also enjoyed painting the sets for the plays at school and used my creativity when creating displays and windows at a recent part-time job. Currently, I spend my Sundays waitressing at a cafe, which develops my quick thinking. Playing the piano has also taught me a lot about patience and perseverance. However, it is physics that is my passion. In the future, I would like to work within astrophysics, trying to solve puzzles such as why there is a storm on Saturn in the shape of a hexagon, or how planetary systems, for instance our own, came to be.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Great reading, everyone. Next slide, please. Right, so here's the whole text. I know it's a bit, for some of you, it might be very small, but here's the whole personal statement in one slide, and also the questions I was kind of getting you to think about earlier on the left. Now, you don't need to type anything into the chat or the Q&A, because we're just going to talk about it ourselves, and hopefully it chimes with some of the things that you were thinking, but feel free to make some notes to write down some ideas. Okay, so Stephanie, as a fellow physicist, I was just wondering, could you pick out any bits of this personal statement that you liked or didn't make sense, or you'd like to know more about? Anything really, just whatever you like.
So yeah, I guess like from the introduction, like that whole sort of comparison to maths is just a bit like, oh, because physics is maths but with more, so it's like it's all sort of encompassed. But I did like that sentence of I want to make that dot a bit bigger, and how they sort of delved into that a lot in the personal statement, and they spoke about how their A-level course was related to their interests, and how they took it further by making that model and doing all these extra things that they did. There was a bit, in the third paragraph, it feels quite general, like the description of astrophysics is very general, like in the first three sentences. And sort of one thing that I would do better if I was the student is make sure that every sentence was showing how it's linked to me and how it's linked to my passion for the subject, rather than trying to describe astrophysics or trying to just describe like astrophysics in general, if that makes sense. But I did think that it was a really good personal statement, and definitely spoke about the interest in a lot of detail while keeping it relevant to their own passion and how it helped them with their exploration of physics. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Brilliant. Just got a question for you, Stephanie. Do you think that where she says astrophysics is the part of physics I feel most pulled towards, do you think that's a little astrophysics joke?
Yeah, it seemed like a bit of a joke. I like that sentence when I read it.
Yeah, because earlier on we put a kind of don't make jokes, and we do mean don't make like knock jokes or anything. But I don't know, the odd little pun like that. I don't know, can't do any harm if you ask me. All right, so Chloe, from you're a scientist, but I don't even know if you did A-level physics. So
I dropped physics as soon as I could. It wasn't for me. I think it was a really good personal statement. I think it starts off very strong. I like that they went from how their A-level course, they found something interesting there, and how they developed on that. I like that they talked about the 2.5 body problem, and solved one of the problems, showing how they developed on their further reading. I like that they said they found more questions, didn't sort of act like they knew everything, which I think can be a danger sometimes in personal statements. People are worried about not understanding everything, but you're not really meant to understand everything. And I also like that there's a lot of content in there, but it doesn't feel like a list. It's all got purpose. And I like the end sentence of what they would like to do in the future. I thought that was a nice way to end it and round it all up.
Yeah, I'm gonna wax lyrical more about the end sentence because it's unusually good in my opinion. Okay, so I'm conscious that Stephanie has to race off shortly. So I was just thinking about the science, Stephanie, which she talks about, finding your own Lagrange points, and then she talks about like cloud. What's the thing? Cloud, something to do with CERN. Where is it? Cloud, some things, and the other bits and pieces. Do you feel like like it's really kind of advanced physics, or is it the kind of stuff that anyone interested in physics could have a go at doing?
It's definitely advanced physics. Like, I study physics as one of my options, and I still don't know about any of this. It definitely shows that the student has done that wider reading, and they clearly know a lot, and they've made that effort to know more about the subject, which is very sort of evident of their passion for physics.
Great. And again, conscious because I know you've got to go. So because you applied for natural sciences at Cambridge, but like the physics route, but did you apply for physics in the other universities or other courses?
With my other universities, I applied to 2 universities for physics, 2 universities for natural sciences, and 1 for chemical physics. So even though my personal statement was quite physics focused, I made like all that natural sciences and chemical physics, like those universities know that those degrees aren't found everywhere. Like, it's not the same as just studying pure chemistry, for example. So I feel like they would have seen it and been like, okay, yeah, we know that this student can't write a personal statement for this subject without including other subjects unless they're applying for chemical physics at all their universities. But I did make sure to sort of include aspects of chemistry that I found interesting, like focusing on physical chemistry or trying to link some biology with physics, and doing all those little things just to show that even though it's predominantly physics that I'm interested in, there are still these other aspects of sciences that I personally enjoy and I want to sort of take forward.
Awesome. That's really interesting, really good. Then maybe final question for you. Cambridge has this special form, doesn't it, which you have to fill in. Did you put anything in there in terms of like personal statement kind of stuff, or did you leave that bit blank?
Yeah, so where there's the option to write an additional personal statement, I didn't actually write anything relating to my course. Like, I just sort of wrote that I had been part of this program that I wasn't able to mention in my personal statement. But no, like, it is completely optional. I think that is something that they heavily emphasize in it. It doesn't disadvantage you if you don't add something, because once again, natural sciences isn't found at a lot of universities. But yeah, I didn't write anything. Like, I didn't make it an additional personal statement, if that makes sense. I just used it to add some extra information about something a bit unrelated.
Okay, Stephanie, that sounds great. Obviously, Phil, I'm not kicking you off or anything. You feel free to stick around as long as you want, but I just thought, in case you were about to go, that I would grill you a little bit. Okay, so I'm still interested in talking more about this personal statement and getting Chloe and indeed Kathryn to say anything that they found interesting, anything they wanted to develop. But just in the meantime, I wanted to talk about the beginning and end. So I've got a bit of a pet hate, and that's elaborate beginnings to personal statements and massively long endings. And I think they're to be avoided because it's really the middle bit that we're most interested in. And I think that this personal statement is just got a fantastic example of how to be brief and to the point but interesting at the beginning and end. So I love the start because, as Chloe was saying, it's quite kind of humble and quite kind of modest and not like over the top and dramatic. It's just like, she likes the idea of there being questions that are unanswered, and she just wants to expand that tiny dot a little bit. I love that. And it's really brief because a lot of tutors, I'm sure, read personal statements, and at the beginning, they're just like, they want to get to the main bit. So they want the beginning to end soon. So I think that's a really good example of a nice, brief, to the point, but interesting personal statement beginning. And then the end, we get so many questions, Kathryn and I, about this, like how much extracurricular stuff do you put in your personal statement? I really like the length of this last paragraph, and I like the tempo as well. I think it's got a great tempo. So she basically says she likes art and it helps her be creative. She says she likes, well, she doesn't say she likes waitressing, but anyway, she waitresses, and it helps with quick thinking. And then she plays the piano, and that's taught her about patience and perseverance. And that is it. That is the extracurricular bit. And it's not a list because she's not listing them. She's just giving us these tiny little insights into the transferable skills that she's learned from these extracurricular things, just really briefly. And I think that's really good. But then she very quickly at the end goes on to saying, well, that's fine, but this is a physics personal statement. So I want to return to physics as my passion at the end. And as Chloe has already highlighted, because she's got a quick brain and an eagle eye, that last sentence for me is gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous because it says, in the future, I'd like to work within astrophysics, trying to solve puzzles such as why there is a storm on Saturn in the shape of a hexagon. And it's just this little like teaser sentence where it's like, I've told you all this stuff that I've been doing that's been really interesting, but there's more to me than this. And here's a little teaser that I haven't got time to tell you about, which is this hexagon-shaped storm on Saturn. And if you Google it, you'll find that there has been some more recent research onto this hexagon-shaped storm, and they've been doing some modelling, and there's a bit more about it. So I just think it's a really nice way to end on an intellectual point that is just really interesting. Anyway, so the beginning and end, I think, of this personal statement is really good. But for the rest, Chloe and Kathryn, is there anything else that you guys picked on that you wanted to say? Or if not, I'll carry on wittering for another couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think I would just build on what Stephanie said before about this being advanced and stuff that even Stephanie hasn't covered and is now going into first year, doing physical natural sciences. And for me, that's a really good example of why the personal statement is so personal. So, if Stephanie applying for physics had looked at this, she might have panicked and thought, I don't know what quasars are, or whatever that word was, or I've never heard of that scientist, or I don't know what, that concept is, I don't know these hexagonal storms. And that's showing, this is just this one person's niche interest in this field, and they've kind of gone down. And Stephanie's statement would have looked completely different and been about what she personally was interested in the course. So even if you're reading this thinking, I want to apply to physics, or I want to apply for astrophysics, or even if you're thinking, I don't really know all about this, that's okay, because your interests are going to be different to someone else's. So don't see this and think, I now need to read that book, or I need to do this. Look at the bits that really interest you, and the bits that you're going to really love studying when you get to university. And the bits that are making you passionate about studying that course for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I reckon there's going to be tutors as well as there'll be so physics tutors, like world famous ones at the top of their game. They'll be like, hexagonal storms on Saturn. I didn't know that. So yeah, don't be thinking I don't know some of this stuff, because as Kathryn has quite rightly said, it's very personal to you. I'll ask you guys again. Thanks, Stephanie. If there's anything else that you'd pick out, but I just wanted to turn to the thorny issue of criticisms. I think Stephanie's already said something very constructive that could have been worked on. I would say there's a couple of things in here where I'm disappointed that they weren't unpacked. So the cloud chambers thing, which I was struggling to find earlier. So she said she went to CERN, which is amazing, right? She went to CERN. It was like a subsidized school trip because I asked her. And so I went to this Hadron Collider in Switzerland or wherever it is. And she says about the cloud chambers, but not much more. And I'm like, what are cloud chambers? Tell us about cloud chambers. But she doesn't. So I think that was maybe a bit of a missed opportunity. And there's limited space, so it's understandable. But I think maybe she could have been more concise with some of her language, which would have perhaps given a little bit more space to talk to us about cloud chambers. And there's another example of that that I wrote down. It's about, so the what's it called, the thing that's been floating through space that's revolutionized our understanding of Saturn, that thing, what's it called, the Cassini thing. In what way has it revolutionized our understanding of Saturn and its rings? Like what has it done that was so amazing? So just a little extra sentence or two there, I think, would have made it even more fascinating personal statement. So yeah, there's just a couple of points where I'm like, don't stop there, tell us a bit more about those things. So yeah, I would have tried to add something else in. Okay, so Stephanie's still here, which is great. Anything else that you wanted to say about this personal statement, or indeed Chloe or Kathryn?
I'll just say overall, I did enjoy reading it, apart from the heavy criticism of maths. It was a good personal statement, I'd say, and I like the way that they sort of linked everything together.
Anything from you, Chloe, or we all nodding in agreement, or Kathryn?
Yeah, I just think it's a good personal statement. It's very personal. I don't understand half of it, but yeah.
Yeah, so me too, but I Googled a lot of it. Okay, so I'm just totally confident that you guys can write something as amazing and extraordinary as this one, and no doubt the ones that Stephanie and Catherine and Chloe wrote. You just got to believe in yourself, and you just got to stick with, exposing yourself to interesting things, reading about them, thinking about them, and for me, most importantly, talking about them. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're encountering, find someone to talk to about it, and then you can just make sense of it in your brain and think about how you would explain it, explaining things in your own terms. So yeah, do that, and then you'll be able to write something as brilliant as this. Okay, so I'm passing over to Catherine now to say some more interesting things, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
Thanks. Yeah, and before I move on to the next slide, actually, I'm just going to, while Stephanie's here and we've got some student points of view, I'll ask a few of the questions that we've got in the Q&A. So the most liked question on this, so 50 people want to know the answer to this, is when should we start writing our personal statement? And so you might know that the Oxbridge application deadline is on 15th of October, and it's usually that date every year. So it does depend on whether you're applying to Oxford or Cambridge or another university, which will have a much later deadline. There isn't any set date that you should start writing by. You might also be the school whether they've given you an internal deadline. So a teacher might say, I want to see your personal statement by September or something like that. But I'll hand over to our panelists just to say from your personal experience, Stephanie and Chloe, when did you start writing or start working on thinking about your personal statement?
I'll go first. So my school had a deadline of September 15th, like exactly a month before in year 13, for like my finished personal statement. And although I'd say that I started writing it in April, I didn't actually start drafting the one that I sent through until August, which I wouldn't recommend. But like I was really sort of indecisive about what I wanted to do. I started with neuroscience, then biochemistry, etc. But yeah, so it just sort of ended up on natural sciences and physics and that sort of thing. And that was via the TED Talk that I was talking about. But yeah, like I started mine August. It wasn't ideal, but I guess it depends on the person. Like if you feel like you work better under pressure, if you feel like you need a longer time so that you can space it out and like not have that stress, then I guess it depends on how you work and what suits you.
Yeah, so I'm pretty similar in the fact that I decided to do medicine quite late. So I was going to apply to Cambridge for chemistry until February of year 12. So I didn't have like everything prepared. I think I probably started mind mapping sort of what I was going to talk about in the summer. My school didn't have an internal deadline until later on because no one else was applying to Oxbridge. So yeah, I think I probably started drafting my actual script in sort of the late summer. But it's not something that takes a really long time once you get the bulk of it. It's just sort of tweaking it. So don't start really early because then you'll just keep on stressing about it. But yeah, give yourself time to sort of mull it over, I guess. Do the little mind map, get it all spaced out in your head, and then when you feel you're ready, just type some ideas out. But remember, your first draft doesn't have to be perfect.
Thank you. And we've got a few questions in the Q&A that are saying, kind of, how can I write about what I've learned from this, and should I include an EPQ that I've done, or should I include this course that I've done? Obviously, there's only a certain amount of space in the personal statement, so it might be that people have done a lot of super-curricular activities, or there's a lot that they love about their course. How did you two kind of pick those few examples that you could actually have space for in your personal statement? So how did you decide like what wasn't going to make the cut?
I guess for me, I knew that I wanted mine to be revolved around a certain theme, and that theme was technology and sort of that link. So I made sure to talk about, I knew the main things that I wanted to talk about that were to do with that link, and that was the TED Talk, that was the work, that was the residential. Those are the main things that I wanted. And then if I couldn't link the other things that I'd done, if I couldn't link it to those things or to the overall theme, then it just wasn't going to be included, because even though I had done a lot of things, if if I couldn't turn it into some sort of story and show this is how it's progressed, then it would just be a bunch of things with no relationship with each other, except for the fact that they are related to science. So yeah, having that overall theme does help in deciding what needs to be mentioned or what needs to be included.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I didn't want to cram things in for the sake of it, so I sort of sketched out all my ideas, sort of why it was important to talk about, so the reflective part of it, which is important. So there was things that were useful, but if I couldn't write something helpful about them, then there wasn't really any point in putting them in. Yeah, and just making everything flow, like we've been saying. And if you don't fit stuff in, that's just stuff to talk about in interviews, so it's not the end of the world.
Thanks very much, Bridgie. I think Stephanie might have had to dash off. She's disappeared, but she wasn't going to be able to stay as long, so that's very nice of her to stay longer to answer questions. We're going to move on to the next session now, just to summarise some things that you can think of doing after this session to build on what we've been talking about. And then Joe and I and Chloe are going to get really into a lot of the questions that have been coming in. If you have written a question, do also keep an eye on the answered column, because we've all been rigorously typing a lot of answers to your questions as well. So for this next part, I want to chat a bit about what you can actively do after this session to build on the activity that you've just done. So looking at a super-curricular activity that you've done, or something that you've been working on at school if you haven't done any super-curricular activities yet. So these are things that you can do after this session to get you thinking about how you can begin drawing those narratives, drawing those connections between the topics of interest and when it comes to actually writing your personal statement. As you've heard from Stephanie and Chloe, you've got plenty of time before you have to write one, but we really hope that you'll be able to do some of these things so that when it does come to actually getting down and writing your personal statement, you'll kind of have a solid lot of notes and things that you can draw on. So take those examples that you've been looking at today and have a look at, is there anything else you could read or do, any other activities or talks that you could watch? Is there anything else that you can do to develop on the ideas that you've been writing about? So if you pick something like a book that or chapter of a book that you'd read, or a problem that you've been working on solving, is there anything else that you can add to that to develop it, to kind of start building up this personal statement of where your interests are taking you? If you haven't been able to do any super-curricular activities yet, or you've done a couple, have a think about what else you can do that's relevant to your subjects. So if you haven't had a look at our subject exploration video, I'm sure Joe will put the link in the chat again. Do take a look, because we've got so many ideas on there. And I know that the Q&A box has a lot of questions of people saying, what can I do for this subject? Or what's a really edgy book that I could read for this subject? Or how can I, what kind of science resources can I access for free? If you have a little look at that video and have a look at the links in the description as well, and the way that we talk about it, you'll see that there's all sorts of things that you can do. And it doesn't just have to be books. I know a lot of you obviously are doing science subjects at school, and you're applying for science subjects at university, so often it won't necessarily be books that you're looking at. And have a think about how your current subjects might relate to each other and how they relate to your chosen subject. But if you I know someone's mentioned, for example, that they're taking a language alongside some maths subjects and want to apply for maths. You could think about how language works, and does that link in with maths? Does that link in with linguistics? All of these things can be connected, and have a think about where your interests lie and if it does relate to your other sciences. Often sciences, especially when you get to university, you'll find that they're so linked together. So if you're applying for chemistry, there's still elements of biology and physics that you'll be able to apply to those as well. So do have a good think about that, because that's all content that you can be thinking about for your personal statement in future. But now we're going to move on to getting through a bunch of these questions that have come in the Q&A box. So we've got a question for medicine, which is great because we've got Chloe here from medicine. What work experience is good for medicine given the current circumstances? So we've had loads of questions about work experience for medicine in the chat, and what I'd say is we do realise that COVID is happening, that people can't get work experience as they could do. So most medical schools are saying, it's not required for applications this year. But Chloe, have you got any ideas of things that people could do that are valuable that aren't, going into a hospital, for example?
Yeah, so in a typical application year, the usual advice is things like care homes, because they're usually quite easy to get into and they can usually be really good to reflect on. But obviously that can't happen this year. So yeah, medical schools are being lax on it. There is online work experience, I think. But I think one of the best things you could do is volunteering. There's a lot of volunteering at the moment, whether that's like helping people get their shopping or helping at a vaccine clinic, sort of marshalling, directing people. Yeah, anything like that. I'm sure there's loads of things available around you. I think that would be really good. And I think that's really easy to reflect on because it's clinical, but then there's also people and the pandemic. It all links in very nicely. So I think stuff like that, because it doesn't have to be specifically medical. It's more about what you get from it. So if you're working with people, that's a really good thing to reflect on. So anything you can get, but if you really can't get anything, I wouldn't worry too much.
Yeah, I'd also say that there are loads of other resources that you can access that aren't work experience. So for example, some people that want to apply for medicine might be vulnerable and not be able to do any in-person volunteering anywhere. There are so many doctors and student doctors and other medical professionals, health professionals that have been putting up taster lectures, have been describing their day. You can follow them on TikTok or YouTube or different social media and catch up with what they're saying life is like as a doctor. Lots of people are doing that because they realise that people applying for medicine can't come in at the moment. So things like that are absolutely valid as well. To say that you have been looking into how life will be as a health professional, and you've maybe been looking on the NHS website and about how the NHS works and kind of getting information that way. So don't worry if you can't do anything in person. We've got a question on, does Oxford and Cambridge consider the personal statement more, or how the interview goes when deciding whether to give an offer? And this is really similar to loads of questions we've had in the chat of might you not get an interview if your personal statement is bad, or could a good personal statement make up for a bad interview, and similar. I'm going to hand over to Joe to answer this question. He's worked in the admissions office now at Brasenose, I think, for over 10 years. So he's very well versed in answering these questions.
Yes, I'm very old. It's true. So, I mean, personal statement, like the way we assess applications is quite holistic. So we're looking at all the different aspects of your application, and it kind of all gets taken into a consideration at once. It is true what I said earlier, that personal statements tend to be a supporting piece of evidence, though, in particular for those subjects, which is most of them, that have an admissions test, because that's also a really good way of assessing your application. So, if you were going to force me, I probably would say ultimately the interview is probably going to be weighted slightly more. But the personal statement is your introduction to the tutors, you see, and first impressions can be important, although, we do look at the whole thing. So, yeah, if you forced me, I'd say interview is probably more important, because we get to meet you and we get to work with you intellectually. But yeah, personal statement's also important. So I think you just have to think that every part of the application, do your best in it, and don't worry about the weighting.
Thank you, Joe. The next question, again, we've had a lot of similar questions to this. For natural sciences, is it better to talk about all the subjects really broadly, or is it okay to just focus on one subject? For example, chemistry. I'm assuming in this case, it's especially if they're applying for chemistry in lots of the universities. So at Cambridge, we're really used to people applying for natural sciences, and their whole statement is just about, physics if they're applying for physical natural sciences, or and they're applying for physics elsewhere, or just talking about chemistry because they're applying for chemistry elsewhere. That's absolutely fine, because we'll know that you're applying for those courses elsewhere, because we know we're the only university that's offering the natural sciences course. So please don't worry if you feel like, oh, it's too chemistry heavy or it's too biology heavy, and do go with where your interests lie. And if those are your interests and that's why you're applying for it at the universities, that's absolutely fine. We're used to seeing loads of personal statements that come in that look like they're just applying for physics or chemistry or biology, and we realise that our course is slightly different to others. Perhaps this is a question, I think Joe was having a little look for Fab, a good resource for those of you who are writing medicine personal statements. I know that's quite a few of you, so I'm going to pop the link in the chat. But perhaps we can again ask Chloe, when it came to writing about your work experience or volunteering, how did you go about actually writing down what you gained from that? Obviously, we're always asking students not just to put what they did, but to actually have a bit of a write about that. How did you write about what you got from it?
So I did it in a few different ways. One way I did a few days in a care home, and there was a woman there who had dementia. So I talked about how difficult it is to care for patients who sort of lose capacity or have those sorts of symptoms, and how that shows the importance of like integrated care. And then I also talked about how I spoke to doctors and nurses, and how that made me realise that it's important to have a team rather than, they like you to understand that it's not just doctors, they like you to talk about sort of the whole team, because it is important. And reflecting on any cases I found in my work experience, and if they sort of made me feel anything, or whether they sort of taught me any lessons. It's really hard to verbalize because it's very personal. And I think you won't always realize what they're teaching you and what you're reflecting on it. You really have to sort of sit there and try and put words to it. But there'll be loads of clips online of medical students talking about their own work experience. So it might help for you to watch some of them, just to sort of realize what it is you're already reflecting on. I don't know, it can be hard to put words to it, but yeah, and it's completely down to whatever you get from it. But don't think that you have to have this sort of miraculous awakening. It can just be like you realize that being a doctor is hard. I think that's one of the things I wrote, because they want you to realize that it's not sunshines and rainbows. So yeah, whatever springs to mind, I guess.
Thanks, Chloe. And we've had quite a few questions saying kind of how can I mention that I read a book or watched a documentary without just describing the entire book or documentary or source. Hopefully from looking at that personal statement example, you saw that she was able to draw on the things that she'd been learning from those things that she watched or read without having to describe it all. So if you can just kind of find a way of mentioning what it is that you're talking about and the bits that interest you about that, and going into depth with the content that actually interests you, that's the best way to go about it. And I know we've had a lot of questions or suggestions of people wanting to, I think, name drop cool things that they've done and say, I went to a talk by such and such, or I went to a session led by such and such from this university. A lot of that is wasting space that you've got by you saying Professor blah 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 or blah 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 university in blah 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 country with the title blah blah blah. You're just taking up like a whole line of the 47 lines that you've got to actually talk about what you're doing. So you can just say, I went to, Prof such and such's lecture, and then you don't even have to say their name. You can say, I went to a lecture on such and such, or I watched a taster lecture online on such and such. We're not going to be impressed by this kind of like name dropping of people who offered it, because we're looking at people based on their academic potential, not based on, kind of what they were able to access and how prestigious it was that they were able to access. We've also got a few questions about how do you write a personal statement if you're applying to a couple of very different subjects or slightly different subjects. How do you kind of consolidate the two when it's the same personal statement going to lots of universities? Again, Joe, I'm going to pick on you for that one.
Yeah, it's a good question. Most people apply for subjects across their 5 choices that are related anyway, so it's not normally like too much of an issue, or they vary a little bit and it's fine. Like the personal statement we looked at earlier, she had applied for physics and then astrophysics and physics, and it didn't really make any difference. But you might be applying for something like medicine and then your pharmacology or psychology or something in as your fifth choice. And I think you just have to think that tutors, whether if they're broadly in medical sciences, which all of those subjects are, they're going to be interested in whatever you're saying anyway. It doesn't matter if it's technically medicine or technically psychology, because they all, hopefully Chloe agrees, kind of merge into one really anyway. It's all like helping and figuring out how people work. So I think you have to just trust that they're going to be interested in whatever intellectual things you say anyway. But I think, if you can try and make it so it's broader anyway, and that you can try and be aware that there is this other subject. So I do like that and not worry about it too much. But Chloe, I guess, did you have a fifth subject that was something else that wasn't medicine?
I didn't use my fifth choice because if I didn't get into medicine, I would just be applied. There wasn't anything else I wanted to do. I think when I was looking at it, I think York University said I could send them like a different personal statement just for chemistry if I used my fifth choice. So some unis might let you do that, but yeah, I think just go with medicine if that's what you're applying for, rather than trying to make it sound okay for a subject that you don't really want to do. I mean, if you're using it as a last choice, it's not like your prime goal, I guess. But yeah, a lot of it will apply anyway. And I think a lot of unis will know that medical students use their fifth choice for something very similar. So I don't think you'd be penalised for that necessarily. I don't know though.
No, I think you're right. I think they know the drill kind of thing. I know Kathryn is. We'll pick on some more questions in a minute, but I just looking through, there's so many questions about work experience, and some of them are you sound a bit worried to me. It's kind of like, what work experience can I do for physics? What work experience can I do for human sciences? Please don't worry. Please don't think that work experience, in most cases, work experience is not mandatory. Work experience is something that you can do if you can manage to sort it out. It's really difficult in these times anyway. But it's normally more important to do reading and to watch interesting documentaries and write some ideas down like we've been saying. So I wouldn't be panicking about work experience in most cases. Veterinary science is an exception, but there's very few where like work experience is absolutely mandatory. So yeah, don't be panicking about work experience. It's just something I wanted to reiterate.
Thank you. We've had quite a few people asking, how do you avoid being boastful, or how do you avoid kind of, sounding really pretentious and like you know everything about this subject when obviously you don't yet. But how do you avoid that when you're trying to big up yourself in a personal statement? Chloe, did you run into that problem when you were trying to sell yourself for medicine?
Yeah, I think it's a very British problem, especially. But yeah, it's very weird for us to have to write about ourselves in a nice way. But it's just something that you've got to do. I think it'll feel like you're boasting a lot more than you are when you're writing it. So maybe just try and push through that at first, write it, and then if you read it back and think this is a bit much or a bit strong, or have someone else read it, that's probably the better idea. Just don't worry about it at first. I think that's a thing to worry about later on. And it shouldn't come out boastful if you're doing the reflection and not listing things and doing all the things we've talked about anyway. But if it does, that's a problem for when you've started drafting rather than before you started writing anything.
Yeah, I'd just add to that excellent comment, just that tutors know you're trying to sell yourself, so they're kind of quite forgiving of cheesiness and boastfulness a little bit. So within reason, I think it's fine that you're trying your best to convince this person that you're perfect for physics at their university. So we know that you're going to be boasting a little bit anyway. But also that example that I showed you earlier, it was quite a humble personal statement. It says she was just like, I just want to widen this little dot a little bit, so you can be really interesting and really intriguing and be quite humble. You don't need to be, but it is possible to write it like that.
I've realised we've kind of come to the end of this session. I'm really impressed that there's still about 300 students who stayed on a few minutes over the line. I think I'll end on this question about, quite a few people have asked about how to actually get started writing with the personal statement.
I was given the advice of don't start with the introduction. So that's what I did. I think the best thing you can do is just start writing, because you're not going to write the perfect draft straight away. But if you just sit worrying about how it started, it's never going to get written. So just accept that your first draft might be a bit rubbish. Just write it, and then you can worry about that later. But yeah, I wrote the body first and then wrote the introduction, just because that felt a bit more natural. So you can do that. I also moved paragraphs around and changed words and all that, but just write a first draft first and then change it from there.
Thanks very much. I think that's all we've got time for today. Thanks, Joe, for being a great co-host. Thank you, Chloe. Shout out to Stephanie, who had to leave earlier, but we appreciated her help. Have a nice evening, everyone, and feel free to get in touch with me or Joe if you've got any follow-up questions. Bye, everyone.